The first morning after the reforms, the silence in Pelican Bay felt louder than the years that came before it. For the men who'd spent a decade or more in the SHU, stepping into open air didn't feel like freedom. It felt like sensory whiplash. The sky looked unreal, the voices around them too sharp, the ground beneath their feet too wide. Some stared at the yard like it was another form of punishment, one they hadn't prepared for. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. The day the doors finally cracked open after the 2015 settlement, the prison tried to celebrate it as a victory. Administrators called it a new chapter. Lawyers called it a historic shift. But inside the fences, among the men who'd lived in absolute isolation, there was no applause. Just uncertainty, and the kind of tension that grows when a system changes faster on paper than in practice. The transformation began with transfers. Hundreds of men were escorted out of the short corridor, some blinking against the fluorescent lights, others refusing to make eye contact with anyone. They were taken to yards they hadn't seen in years, surrounded by inmates they'd once only communicated with through vents and kites. Officers kept telling them the same thing: "You're back in population now. Make it work." But nothing about it was simple. Some hadn't spoken more than a few words in years. Others couldn't handle the noise, the movement, the proximity. Their bodies remembered the rules of isolation, not the rhythms of shared space. One man stepped into the day room and immediately turned around, asking to go back to his cell. Another froze in the middle of the yard, hands trembling, overwhelmed by the open sky. And then there were the men with reputations, leaders, shot callers, and old enemies who'd been separated for a reason. Bringing them back together wasn't just a psychological gamble. It was a security risk. The first incident came fast. It happened on C Yard, mid-morning. A simple argument: who controlled a table, who spoke to who owed what. A guard said later it looked like nothing at first, just two men locking eyes too long. But in prisons like Pelican Bay, small things aren't small. Within seconds, bodies moved. A punch. A tackle. Others stepped in. Officers hit alarms. To outsiders, it was just a fight. Inside the walls, it was a warning: reform didn't erase history. It dragged it into the sunlight. By the end of the week, staff quietly admitted the truth: some of these men weren't ready for group yards. And some yards weren't ready for them. The mental health team struggled to keep up. Officers tried to predict where tensions would break next. Inmates tried to figure out the new rules of survival. Everyone felt the ground shifting, and no one trusted it. What no one realized yet was this: the most dangerous cracks weren't in the yards or the cells, but in the system that claimed it had changed. And the first real test of those reforms was just beginning. The truth settled in fast: Pelican Bay had changed its rules, but the culture inside hadn't caught up. The reforms ended indefinite solitary confinement, but they didn't erase the networks that had grown in the dark. The SHU had been a pressure cooker, and when the doors opened, everything that had been held in place by concrete and distance spilled into the yards. Behind the official memos and cheerful press statements, staff whispered about a growing problem: some inmates were unraveling, and others were recalculating. Men who once led entire blocks from behind steel doors were now re-entering social ecosystems that had evolved without them. Power didn't disappear, it shifted. One counselor described it bluntly: you don't lock men away for 10, 15, 20 years, then drop them back into society, especially this society, and expect them to blend in. They're either ghosts or legends, and neither one is safe. The psychological damage surfaced in quiet moments. A man who flinched every time someone walked behind him. Another who couldn't eat in the chow hall because the crowd made his heart pound. Some paced the yard like caged animals, not because they wanted to escape, but because the motion felt like the only thing they still recognized. But alongside the fragility came something harder to manage: strategy. The end of gang validation as a reason for endless isolation forced the prison to rely on behavior, not affiliation. It sounded fair in policy. In practice, it meant that old alliances formed in silence were now gathering in the open. Guards noticed groups meeting at the far edges of the yard, speaking quietly, sharing looks instead of words. None of it broke the new rules. All of it felt like preparation. Administrators tried to stay ahead, holding meetings, adjusting schedules, tightening protocols. But they were also dealing with another problem: staff shortages. Fewer officers meant more blind spots. More blind spots meant more opportunities. More opportunities meant risk. One sergeant described it like watching a wildfire through a window. You see where it's burning. You see where it's spreading. But you also know there's more happening out of sight. Rumors drifted through the cell blocks. A certain group wanted to reclaim influence. Another believed the reforms were a sign of weakness. Some inmates insisted the SHU had created a generation of men who no longer cared about the old politics. Others argued it created men who saw everything as politics. The tension wasn't explosive, it was patient. And patience inside a prison is never a good sign. The breaking point came from a place no one expected, a program designed to help former SHU inmates reintegrate. What began as a tool for healing turned into a window into something deeper. A staff member sorting through routine assessments noticed a detail, a pattern of names showing up together in places they shouldn't. Groups attending programs on the same days. Men sitting in the same corners of the yard. Conversations repeated across interviews without being prompted. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't friendship. It was coordination. The discovery didn't reveal a new conspiracy. It revealed something more unsettling. The old structures hadn't been dismantled, they'd adapted. Reform had changed the map. But the players were simply learning how to move on it. And buried in the middle of those subtle shifts was one detail, small, easy to overlook, that would force Pelican Bay to confront a truth no one wanted to admit. A detail the staff member didn't even realize mattered, at least, not yet. The detail everyone missed at first was a timestamp. A simple, forgettable timestamp on a counseling log. 3 men who weren't supposed to cross paths had signed into different programs within minutes of each other. Different rooms, different purposes, same schedule. On paper, it looked harmless. In a place like Pelican Bay, it was anything but. When staff retraced the pattern, they found it again. And again. And again. The reform had broken the physical walls of the SHU, but it had accidentally created new soft corridors, moments in time where movement aligned, where the right men could see each other, pass each other, or signal each other without ever breaking a rule. It didn't take long for administrators to realize the uncomfortable truth: the very programs meant to help reintegration were becoming unofficial meeting points. When word of this reached the warden's office, the response was immediate. Schedules were rewritten overnight. Programs were split. Officers were reassigned. The messaging was calm and controlled, but the urgency was real. The old fear was back, not that violence would erupt instantly, but that the system was being quietly maneuvered into a position no one wanted to see play out. Yet the deeper issue wasn't strategy. It was psychology. Many of the men caught in this web weren't planning anything. They were simply trying to survive in an environment they no longer understood. The years in isolation had carved out habits that didn't disappear just because a lawsuit said they should. Hypervigilance. Withdrawal. Suspicion. Silence. These weren't behaviors, they were survival mechanisms. And for some, the return to open yards unleashed something even harder to confront: grief. Grief for the years lost. Grief for families that moved on. Grief for identities shaped in darkness and suddenly expected to function in daylight. One counselor explained it in a way that stayed with everyone who heard it. You can release a man from isolation, but you can't release what isolation did to him. That was the truth the reform didn't prepare anyone for. As Pelican Bay adjusted, the prison gradually tightened its grip again, not through the old SHU structure, but through new monitoring systems, behavioral reviews, and specialized yards. It wasn't a return to the past, but it was a reminder that change in a place built on control is a slow, uneven thing. Some inmates did rebuild their lives inside those fences. Others never found their footing. And a few simply vanished into the routine, walking the yards but never truly coming back from where they'd been. The settlement had cracked open the door to a new era. It ended a system that isolated men for decades with no clear path out. But it couldn't erase the scars, the politics, or the culture shaped by that isolation. The biggest shift wasn't physical, it was philosophical. Pelican Bay had been forced to look directly at the consequences of what it created. And so had the world watching from the outside. In the end, the reforms brought progress, but not closure. They brought sunlight, but not healing. They brought change, but not transformation. Some wounds inside Pelican Bay can be treated. Others will echo in those corridors for years. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.